So in the last episode, I told you about my visit to the San Antonio Zoo, and I warned you that the next several episodes would be inspired by that visit. In keeping with that promise, today's episode is about an animal that most of us will only see in zoos, and whenever we do, we ooh and we ah and we remark on how cute they are, but we don't really get to know them beyond that surface level. And then we immediately forget about them when the next animal catches our eye. Seriously, how often do you give the topic of today's episode, lemurs, a second thought? Now, to be fair, they're endemic to Madagascar. They primarily live in trees, and they're generally nocturnal. They're found in most zoos, but outside of a zoo, unless you happen to find yourself in Madagascar at night, you're probably not going to see one. In fact, the name lemur is from the Latin word lemures, which translates as spirit or ghost. So let's get to know these little adorable spirits better. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, and this is the Dispatches from the Forest podcast. So what exactly is a lemur? Is it some sort of raccoon, a kind of squirrel, a monkey maybe? Well, that last one is the closest. Lemurs are primates, and while they share some resemblance to other primates, they evolved separately from monkeys and apes. They're part of a suborder of primates known as wet-nosed primates. I'll give you 3 guesses why. If you said, because they have a wet nose, well, congratulations, you're right. This suborder includes Madagascar's lemurs, Africa's pottos, and Southeast Asia's lorises. And don't feel bad if you've never heard of a potto, because I hadn't either. There are 8 families and about 100 species of lemur, and again, they all are endemic to Madagascar. Now, since making their way to Madagascar 20 to 60 million years ago or so, lemurs adapted to fill many open ecological niches. Being isolated on Madagascar, they had a limited number of mammalian competitors, so lemurs didn't have to compete with any other evolving arboreal mammal groups like, say, squirrels. They were also spared from having to compete with other primates, like monkeys, which evolved later, and whose intelligence, aggression, and deceptiveness gave them an advantage over other primates when it came to exploiting their environments. But in spite of this evolution in isolation, lemurs still share many common traits with primates, like having fingers and toes, and in most species, nails instead of claws. But in lemurs, their thumb is only pseudo-opposable, meaning its movement is not entirely independent from the other fingers, and as a result, their hands are not quite as good for grasping and manipulating objects. On a side note, most lemurs have an elongated nail known as a toilet claw on the second toe, which is used for scratching and grooming. Now, why toilet claw instead of scratching or grooming claw? I don't know. The first toe on their back foot is used for grasping tree limbs, and unlike a monkey's, and contrary to popular belief, a lemur's tail is not prehensile. Lemurs rely heavily on their sense of smell, both to find food and communicate with each other, something especially useful at night when vision is limited. Lemurs will scent mark with urine and also scent glands that are located on the wrists, inside of the elbows, genitals, or the neck. They also communicate using pheromones, which is facilitated by that wet nose. Now, it's usually thought that a wet nose helps enhance the sense of smell, but it's actually a touch-based sense organ that connects with a well-developed vomeral nasal organ, VNO for short. It's kind of like an extra nose located just above the roof of the mouth. You ever see a cat sniff something and then pull away with its mouth slightly opened and it's almost kind of panting? That's the cat accessing its VNO. Since pheromones are usually large, non-volatile molecules, the nose is used to touch a scent-marked object and transfer the pheromone molecules to the VNO. So while they share some common traits, evolving in relative isolation without much competition from other mammals means that the diversity of lemurs in both behavior and morphology, or outward appearance, rivals that of the monkeys and apes found elsewhere in the world. Diet-wise, lemurs are generally omnivores, although their diets consist primarily of plant material. But that said, they're still highly variable. Generally speaking, the smallest species of lemur primarily eat fruit and insects, while larger species tend to be more herbivorous. But that said, like all primates, hungry lemurs will eat anything edible that they can get their hands on, whether or not it's one of their preferred foods. Lemurs range in size from the tiny mouse lemur, which barely tops 1 ounce or 30 grams, to the 20-pound, 9-kilogram Indri. But on a side note, since the arrival of humans on Madagascar about 2,000 years ago, over a dozen species of giant lemurs, larger than the Indri, have gone extinct. This is why we can't have nice things, people. Or, more accurately, this is why we can't have nice things, people. We'll come back to that later. The best estimates place the smallest of the extinct giant lemur species at about 22 pounds, 10 kilograms. So, yeah, okay, just slightly larger than the Indri. But the largest species of extinct giant lemur, Archaeoindris, weighed in at a whopping 350 to nearly 450 pounds, 160 to 200 kilograms, comparable to a male gorilla. Aside from size, different species of lemurs evolved unique combinations of traits to cope with Madagascar's harsh seasonal climate. Some of these traits include seasonal fat storage and hypometabolism, which is just a fancy way of saying they hibernate or go into torpor, a variety of social organization patterns, smaller relative brain size, a variety of activity patterns, including cathamorality, which is a fancy way of saying they're active both during the day and during the night, as opposed to being more strictly diurnal, nocturnal, or crepuscular, and strict breeding seasons. Extreme limitations on resources and seasonal breeding cycles are also thought to have given rise to 3 other relatively common lemur traits: female social dominance, sexual monomorphism, which means that males and females are the same size, and the competition between males for mates involving relatively low levels of aggression. On a side note, there is a correlation in lemurs between the level of aggression and the length of the canine teeth. The bigger the teeth, the higher the level of aggression. So let's examine a couple of these traits more closely. We'll start with fat storage and hypometabolism because they kind of go hand in hand. Lemurs already have a relatively low metabolism to start with, and they can further lower their metabolic rate to 20% below the value predicted for other mammals of a similar body mass. Now, usually we think of this kind of thing as being a winter behavior, a way for an animal to deal with the food shortages that accompany cold and snow. But for lemurs, it's a little bit different. Instead of cold and snow, they need to be able to survive the food shortages that come with the dry season. Dwarf lemurs and mouse lemurs exhibit seasonal cycles of dormancy, basically hibernation or torpor. In fact, they're the only primates known to do so. While mouse lemurs may experience torpor lasting for several days, dwarf lemurs hibernate for 6 to 8 months of the year, 5 of that in a continuous deep hibernative state, bookended by some transitional time when they forage on a limited basis to protect their fat reserves. Because before the dry season, dwarf lemurs accumulate fat in the base of their tails and in their hind legs, doubling their weight, not unlike a groundhog or a bear preparing for winter. By the end of this dormancy, their body mass might be only half of what it was prior to the start of the dry season. Now, as for activity patterns, the circadian rhythms of different lemur species varies from nocturnal in smaller lemurs to diurnal in most larger lemurs. But some of the larger lemurs also exhibit something called cathamorality, which is when an animal is active sporadically both day and night, a pattern exhibited by few, if any, other primates. Cathamerality is a relatively recent discovery, not really identified or named until the 1960s, which explains why my spell check hates it. Other animals that are now known to exhibit cathamerality include lions and coyotes, one of my favorites. Being a relatively new discovery, not much is really known about this activity pattern and what influences whether and why an animal might exhibit cathamerality. But, of course, there are theories. Cathemeral animals can forage for food at any point during a 24-hour day to maximize energy and nutrient intake. The implication here is that they have the opportunity to eat up to twice as much as a more strictly nocturnal or diurnal species. While lemurs have a low metabolic rate, it would explain why this pattern is seen in larger species that would have higher caloric needs. It may be a way to avoid predators. When active during the day, lemurs have a high risk of predation from both raptors and fossa, which is a cat-like carnivore also endemic to Madagascar. Limiting daytime activity reduces this risk. Some species display seasonal cathamerality. For example, the mongoose lemur shifts its activity from predominantly diurnal to predominantly nocturnal and back again over the course of a year, while the common brown lemur shifts between a diurnal and a cathemeral pattern. Ambient air temperature and the amount of light from the moon may also influence the amount of daytime versus nighttime activity. So now let's look at social organization. Of all the wet-nosed primates, lemurs are the most social, living in groups called troops, though also sometimes called a mob or a conspiracy, generally consisting of less than 15 individuals. But the structure of lemur troops takes a variety of forms, and the degree of socialization varies by species, gender, location, and season. Nocturnal lemurs tend to be what's called solitary but social, foraging alone at night, but often nesting in groups during the day. Some species, like the ruffed lemur, have what's called a fission-fusion society, where the size and composition of the social group changes as time passes and individuals move through the environment. They'll form large groups, for example, all sleeping in the same place, but then break into smaller groups to forage. Other species, like that largest living species, the indri, form pair bonds, mated pairs sticking together. The most common groups, though, are multiple male groups, similar to monkeys and apes. These are relatively permanent, cohesive groups. But what makes lemur societies unique is that, with only a couple of exceptions, most species have female-dominated societies. So far, nobody has been able to definitively say why lemurs exhibit female dominance while other primates with similar social structures don't. The dominant view is that it's an advantage given the high costs of reproduction and the scarcity of resources. Speaking of reproduction, thanks to the highly seasonal availability of resources, lemurs have very short mating seasons, lasting at most just a few weeks, and in some species, maybe just a few hours. Lemurs time their mating and birth seasons so that all weaning periods are synchronized to match the time of highest food availability. Makes sense. These narrow windows for reproduction and resources, though, appear to relate to the lemur's short gestation period, rapid maturation, and low metabolic rate. It may also relate to the relatively high mortality rate among adult females and the higher proportion of adult males in some lemur populations, both unusual traits among primates. Gestation ranges anywhere from 9 to 24 weeks depending on the species, and most species have a single offspring, although some can have 2 or even 3 or more. After the babies are born, lemurs will carry them around, either by the scruff or by the baby clinging to the mom's back, or they might stash them while foraging. Nocturnal species are more likely to stash their babies when they're foraging. Alloparenting, where unrelated adults help care for the young, is common in lemurs, and in some species, unrelated females may even nurse the young. Okay, I'm going to end, as I often do, talking about conservation. Before the arrival of humans, roughly 1,500 to 2,000 years ago, lemurs were found all across the island of Madagascar, including the giant lemurs that I talked about earlier. But early settlers quickly converted the forest to rice paddies and grassland using slash and burn agriculture, restricting lemurs to just 10% of the island. And habitat destruction continues to threaten lemurs. Slash and burn agricultural practices continue to be used along with both legal and illegal gathering of wood for both firewood and charcoal production. Commercial mining and the illegal logging of hardwood for foreign markets also threatens the environment. Additional threats include climate change, of course, and illegal hunting. Conservation is a tough thing to sell to locals because Madagascar is one of the poorest countries in the world, with over 70% of its population living in poverty. Because of the many threats they face and their declining numbers, the International Union for Conservation of Nature considers lemurs to be the world's most endangered mammals, noting that up to 90% of all lemur species confront the threat of extinction in the wild within the next 20 to 25 years. And for the record, that reference was from 12 years ago, so we're even closer now. But ecotourism, driven by the presence of lemurs, is helping local communities living in the vicinity of Madagascar's national parks by offering employment opportunities and giving half of the park entrance fees to the local community. Conservation is also facilitated by the Madagascar Fauna Group, an association of nearly 40 zoos and related organizations. So hopefully these efforts, along with captive breeding programs, can help bolster declining populations and save the lemurs. And with that, my feral friends, we put another episode in the books. If you want to support the podcast, well, I'm not going to argue. Here's some ways to do that. Become a patron. Subscriptions start at just $5 a month, and with 3 paid months, you get some sweet Dispatches from the Forest merch. Find all the details at patreon.com/dispatchesfromtheforest. You can donate through PayPal using my email address, dispatchesfromtheforest@gmail.com, which is also a great way to contact me if you have any questions, comments, or requests for future episodes. If you want to just send a check, well, that's fine too. Email me and I'll let you know what my mailing address is. You can donate using the Cash App and the hashtag ForestNerd. Go check out the merch store at cafepress.com/shop/dispatchesfromtheforest, then click on products and find something you like. Finally, you can follow Dispatches from the Forest on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, reminding you to go outside and get dirty. The Dispatches from the Forest podcast is a production of Dispatches from the Forest and may not be used or rebroadcast whole or in part without express written permission.